Is the bill stand as printed?
Senator Waters, I think.
Senator Waters.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I'd like to go on record thanking the government for finally acting on the issue of coal seam gas and its effect on aquifers. It's not before time, as folk in this chamber will know and anyone listening will know. The Greens have moved several bills to address this issue in the last 18 months to 2 years. And that's because not only of community concern but also significant scientific concern. And fundamentally, we simply cannot surmount the fact that we do not know enough about aquifers and their interaction between coal seams and possible connections that can be created once a hole is punched through an aquifer to get to a coal seam in order to extract the gas. We cannot be sure that we're not then making connections that will see the groundwater table drop, or that will see that groundwater contaminated either by the residual fracking fluids that are left in the coal seam or indeed by naturally occurring BTECs, which, in a very scary development, we now learn can be mobilised by the process of hydraulic fracturing. So unfortunately, we still know that coal seam gas is not safe in the long term for water. We don't know the quantum of risk associated with that, but frankly, we shouldn't take the risk. In the driest inhabited continent on the planet, we need to make sure that we will still be able to supply the water that's needed to continue to be a net food exporter in this growing age of food insecurity. So we welcome these new powers that will be given to the Federal Environment Ministers to at last take into account the impacts of water when thinking about approving coal and coal seam gas mining. Now, of course, that's no guarantee that the minister might actually come to the correct decision. It simply arms him or her, of course it's Minister Burke at the moment, simply arms Minister Burke with information to make hopefully a correct decision. Of course, there is huge discretion in the Act. The minister is empowered to make a decision to approve a project, even if it's going to have significant impacts on a matter of national environmental significance. So I'm afraid this bill, whilst being a good step, is certainly no panacea. It's going to take a courageous minister who's prepared to listen to the science and listen to the community to actually protect this country from coal seam gas and the risks that it poses. And while I'm on the risks, it's not just water, of course, that we're talking about here. It's also risks to the climate. We know that finally CSIRO is now doing some independent studies into how much this stuff leaks. We know the only other independent science that's been done indicates that ambient levels of methane are about 3 times above what they are elsewhere, where coal seam gas extraction is occurring. So we have some quantification on an independent basis already that shows you that coal seam gas leaks like a sieve. And this is methane, which is 26 times more powerful in terms of greenhouse gases than is carbon dioxide. So we know this is dangerous for the climate. We know it risks long-term damage to our aquifers. And frankly, that is why it is long past time that we have some federal oversight. The states have failed in properly looking after land and water. We've heard lots and lots of discussion today about the state laws that apply to coal seam gas. Unfortunately, they're simply not adequate. In Queensland, we've seen an unseemly rush, and coal seam gas has been approved on our best food-producing land. Now, I've talked about aquifer and climate impacts, but there's also surface impacts. In that coal seam gas Senate inquiry that I was pleased to start off my term in this place being a participating member for, we actually learnt that it can interfere with surface operations. And farmers were saying they were wanting to buy new equipment, or they had purchased new equipment which required certain turning circles, which required certain the layout of their farm to be a certain way, and the coal seam gas wells threatened to interfere with that. So we saw a potential outcome of more progressive technologies being used to apply less inputs to farmland, potentially being threatened by coal seam gas wells. So not just water impacts, not just climate impacts, but also surface operation impacts, which is exactly why I'll be moving amendments on behalf of the Australian Greens to give landholders the right to say no to coal seam gas. Why should it be that landholders have to take the risk of long-term damage to aquifers? Why should they bear that risk? This bill, the amendments that I will move to this bill in due course, will allow the landholder to say no to coal seam gas, and it will say that the minister is not actually able to approve coal or coal seam gas until he has before him the consent of the landholder, and until that consent has been given after the landholder has got both legal advice and scientific advice. Now that's crucial because, as we've seen, the coal seam gas companies are effectively trying to bully people into being bought off with sometimes ample, sometimes pitiful levels of compensation. Of course, the amount is kept confidential, so nobody knows whether they're being ripped off or not. And this tactic is being held over landowners because they know they can't say no. So this is exactly why we need to respect the fact that landholders don't want to take that risk with their land, and it should be the government that bears that risk. This amendment won't change the ownership of the minerals. The Crown will still own those minerals, as has been raised today, and if the government deems those resources so important that they actually need to be extracted, then the government can use its acquisition powers, as it can in any other instance under the Constitution, and indeed as many state governments can under their own state acquisition laws. So this does not change the ownership of the minerals nor sterilise the resource, a point I hope the Coalition appreciates. It simply gives landholders a better bargaining position. So I want to ask the acting minister, forgive me if that's not the correct terminology. Oh, I'm asking the minister, my apologies, Senator. I want to ask the minister, why has it taken the government so long to finally move on coal seam gas when you've had your own CSIRO, National Water Commission and now the Independent Expert Scientific Committee advising for many years on the uncertainties about groundwater impacts, when CSIRO haven't even finished looking at the climate impacts? Why this unseemly haste to approve everything? Why has Minister Burke ticked off, in fact in the first 6 months of him being the Environment Minister, ticked off on those 3 big Queensland projects, currently considering a 4th? And why, in February this year, did Minister Burke tick off on Gloucester, Boggabri, Maules Creek and Tarrawonga, and then within several days afterwards suddenly decide to then regulate water? Why the timing here, why the delay, and why the continued refusal to not properly consider the scientific advice about the uncertainties of this industry?
Thank you, Senator Waters. Minister.
Thank you. The government will not be supporting the amendment. The proposed amendment would broaden the scope of the water trigger so that it may apply to the shale gas, tight gas and underground coal gasification projects. The water trigger is intended to build on the objectives of the National Partnership Agreement, which is limited to coal seam gas and large coal mining. And the proposed water trigger is also intended to build on the established role of the Independent Scientific Expert Committee, which provides advice on coal seam gas and large coal mining development. As noted in the Senate Committee's report on the bill, the rapid and extensive development of coal mining and CSG mining in particular, and the great community concern that these activities have raised, require that concerns about these activities should be addressed. I'll see if there's any further information. I suspect some of those were slightly rhetorical in the other questions you asked, Senator, but if there's any further information I can gather on those, I will seek to do so.
Thank you, Minister. Just before, Senator Waters, before I call you, I'll just point out for the benefit of senators, we haven't actually had an amendment moved as yet. Senator Waters is still to do that, so we are having a general discussion about this bill. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your rhetorical flourish. I would appreciate a little bit more detail as you've taken that on notice. Look, Minister, I want to ask, and I mean I'll be moving these amendments in due course, but why the restriction to just coal seam gas and coal mining, and why these very creatively crafted commencement provisions that make sure that you've effectively got 1 foot in one camp and 1 foot in the other? Was there really any consideration of, let me phrase it this way, at what point did Minister Burke formulate the intention to introduce the water trigger bill, and was that before or after he approved those 4 New South Wales projects that I mentioned earlier, Gloucester, Coal Seam Gas, Maules Creek, Boggabri and Tarrawonga coal mines?
Thank you, Senator.